You watch colleagues with less experience get promoted while you work twice as hard, delivering superior results, yet remaining invisible when opportunities arise. Every day you pour energy into tasks that seem important, yet somehow you stay, overlooked while others effortlessly position themselves for advancement, leaving you wondering if merit actually matters anymore. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese strategist who mastered the art of positioning in the deadliest arena of all, the battlefield. For over 2,500 years, my strategic principles have guided victorious leaders through wars, business conquests, and career transformations. What I discovered about strategy will revolutionize how you approach your professional life, giving you the positioning advantage to win before your competition realizes the game has begun. The battlefield may have changed from ancient China to modern offices, but the principles of strategic positioning and timing remain as powerful today as they were millennia ago. Whether you're fighting for territory or fighting for recognition, strategy determines the outcome. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for strategic mastery. I was not born understanding strategy. Like you, I once believed that strength and effort alone determined victory. I watched my father's generation fight battles with courage and determination, only to see their armies crushed by enemies who seemed weaker but fought smarter. Those early defeats carved deep lessons into my young mind. Growing up in the warring states of ancient China, I witnessed commanders who confused activity with progress, who mistook loudness for leadership, and who believed that charging harder would overcome superior positioning. I saw brave soldiers die needlessly because their leaders never learned the difference between tactics and strategy. These observations haunted me and drove me to seek a different path. The turning point came when I was barely 20, observing a siege that should have been won easily. Our forces outnumbered the enemy 3-1. Our soldiers were better trained, better equipped, better fed. Yet, day after day, we hurled ourselves against their walls while they picked us off with ease. Our commander grew increasingly frustrated, ordering more direct assaults, more aggressive attacks, more of the same failing approach. That's when I understood the fundamental truth that would guide my entire philosophy. Position determines outcome. The enemy wasn't stronger than us. They were better positioned. They had chosen their ground carefully, forcing us to attack uphill, across open terrain, into prepared defenses. They made us come to them on their terms, turning our strength into a liability. I began studying every conflict differently. Instead of watching the clash of arms, I observed the preparation, the positioning, the decision-making that happened before the first sword was drawn. I noticed that victorious generals spent more time thinking than fighting, more energy preparing than attacking, more effort positioning than charging. My first independent command came during a border dispute with a neighboring state. Instead of following conventional wisdom and meeting their army head-on, I studied their patterns, their supply lines, their decision-making processes. I learned when their commanders ate, how they communicated with their scouts, where they felt most confident and most vulnerable. While they prepared for a traditional battle, I positioned my forces to control their retreat routes and threaten their supply trains. When they finally realized my strategy, they found themselves in an impossible position, not defeated by superior force, but outmaneuvered by superior thinking. They surrendered without a major battle, preserving both armies while achieving our objectives completely. This victory taught me that the supreme excellence is not winning 100 battles, but subduing the enemy without fighting at all. True strategy creates conditions where your desired outcome becomes inevitable, where resistance becomes futile, where your opponents defeat themselves through their own poor positioning. From that moment, I dedicated my life to understanding the principles that govern all conflicts, not just military ones, but any situation where competing interests must be resolved. I realized that whether you're fighting for territory, resources, influence, or advancement, the same strategic principles apply. Position, timing, information, and preparation determine outcomes far more than effort or talent alone. These early experiences shaped my understanding that strategy is not about being clever or cunning. It's about seeing clearly, thinking systematically, and positioning yourself so that success becomes the natural result of your preparation rather than a matter of luck or chance. Most people fundamentally misunderstand what strategy actually is. They confuse it with tactics, with planning, with working harder, or with being more aggressive. I watch modern professionals make the same mistake that doomed countless armies. Throughout history, they focus on the doing instead of the positioning. Let me clarify this distinction because your career depends on understanding it. Tactics are what you do in the moment, how you handle a meeting, respond to an email, or complete a project. Strategy is about where you position yourself before those moments arrive. Tactics are about execution. Strategy is about creating conditions where successful execution becomes inevitable. When I developed my understanding of strategy, I realized it operates on a completely different level than most people recognize. While others were studying sword techniques and battles formations, I was studying the forces that determined who would win before the swords were ever drawn. I discovered that strategy is not about fighting better. It's about fighting only when victory is already assured. This revelation changed everything for me. I began to see that the most important battles are won in the preparation phase, in the positioning phase, in the information gathering phase. By the time armies actually clash, the outcome has usually been determined by the strategic choices made weeks or months earlier. In your modern workplace, this principle remains absolutely true. The promotion goes to the person who positioned themselves strategically, not necessarily the person who worked the hardest on the day the decision was made. The recognition goes to the person who made themselves visible to the right people at the right time, not just the person who did excellent work in isolation. Here's what I learned about true strategy. It's the art of making your success inevitable through superior positioning. When you are positioned correctly, opportunities flow toward you naturally. When you are positioned poorly, even tremendous effort produces minimal results. I remember a campaign where we faced an enemy with superior numbers and equipment. Traditional thinking would have suggested we needed to fight harder, recruit more soldiers, or develop better weapons. Instead, I studied their position and realized they had chosen ground that looked strong, but actually made them vulnerable to a completely different approach. Rather than attacking their strength directly, I positioned my forces to control their water supply. Within 3 days, they were negotiating surrender, not because we were stronger, but because we had created conditions where their position became untenable. They defeated themselves by maintaining an unsustainable position. This is the essence of strategic thinking, creating conditions where your desired outcome becomes the logical result of the situation you've created. Instead of trying to force results through effort, you shape the environment so that results flow naturally from the structure you've established. In your career, this means identifying the real sources of power and opportunity in your organization, understanding the actual decision-making processes, and positioning yourself at the intersection of where value is created and recognized. It means being where the important conversations happen, building relationships with people who influence outcomes, and making yourself indispensable to processes that matter. Most people exhaust themselves trying to prove their worth through output. Strategic thinkers position themselves so their worth becomes obvious and their advancement becomes logical. They don't work harder, they work from better positions. The fundamental truth I want you to understand is this: strategy is not about what you do, but about where you do it from. It's not about how much effort you apply, but about applying the right amount of effort in the right place at the right time. Master this distinction, and you'll find that success becomes not a matter of chance or extraordinary effort, but the natural result of strategic positioning. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. This is perhaps my most quoted principle, yet most people focus only on the second half, knowing the enemy, while completely neglecting the first and most crucial element, knowing yourself. I learned this lesson through painful experience. Early in my career, I accepted a command that seemed perfect, leading a cavalry unit in what appeared to be a straightforward mission. I was young, ambitious, and eager to prove myself. I studied the enemy meticulously, mapped their positions, analyzed their weaknesses, and developed what I thought was a flawless plan. The mission failed spectacularly, not because I misunderstood the enemy, but because I misunderstood myself. I had positioned myself in a role that required skills I hadn't yet developed, commanding troops whose strengths I hadn't properly assessed, in terrain that neutralized my natural advantages. I knew everything about them and nothing about my own true capabilities. That failure taught me that self-knowledge is not optional. It's the foundation upon which all strategy must be built. You cannot position yourself effectively if you don't understand what you're positioning. You cannot leverage your strengths if you haven't identified them accurately. You cannot protect your weaknesses if you're not honest about what they are. True self-knowledge requires brutal honesty. I developed a practice of regular self-assessment that became the cornerstone of my strategic thinking. Before every campaign, I would spend days in reflection, examining not just what I wanted to achieve, but what I was actually capable of achieving given my current resources, skills, and position. I asked myself questions that most people avoid. What are my genuine strengths, not the ones I wish I had? What are my actual weaknesses, not the ones I'm comfortable admitting? Where do I naturally excel, and where do I consistently struggle? What patterns of success and failure can I identify in my past decisions? This process revealed uncomfortable truths. I discovered that I was better at defensive strategies than offensive ones, better at long-term planning than quick tactical adjustments, better at inspiring loyalty than commanding fear. These insights forced me to adjust my approach completely. Instead of trying to become someone I wasn't, I began positioning myself in situations where my natural strengths would be decisive advantages. I chose campaigns that rewarded patience over aggression, planning over improvisation, coalition building over individual heroics. Suddenly, my success rate improved dramatically, not because I had become more capable, but because I was finally operating from positions that matched my true capabilities. In your modern career, this same principle applies with equal force. Most professionals fail, not because they lack talent, but because they're trying to succeed in roles or environments that don't match their authentic strengths. They've accepted others' definitions of success instead of identifying what they're naturally positioned to achieve. Start by conducting an honest inventory of your professional strengths. What tasks energize you rather than drain you? In what environments do you naturally excel? What types of problems do you solve more easily than your colleagues? What feedback do you consistently receive about your best contributions? Equally important, identify your genuine limitations. What responsibilities consistently stress you? Where do you find yourself struggling despite significant effort? What skills have you tried to develop but never quite mastered? What environments diminish your effectiveness? This isn't about accepting limitations. It's about understanding your strategic position accurately so you can leverage your strengths and protect your weaknesses. When you know yourself clearly, you can choose battles you're positioned to win and avoid conflicts that play to your disadvantages. I also learned to assess my resources honestly. What political capital do I have? What relationships can I leverage? What unique knowledge or access do I possess? What constraints am I operating under? Understanding your true strategic position means acknowledging both your assets and your limitations. Self-knowledge also means understanding your motivations and values. What actually drives you? What outcomes genuinely matter to you? What are you willing to sacrifice? And what principles won't you compromise? Strategic positioning becomes much clearer when you understand what you're really trying to achieve. Remember, knowing yourself is not a one-time assessment. It's an ongoing practice. Your strengths evolve, your position changes, your resources shift. Regular self-evaluation ensures that your strategy remains aligned with your actual capabilities rather than your aspirations or assumptions. When you truly know yourself, strategic positioning becomes much simpler. You stop trying to force square pegs into round holes and start looking for the positions where you can apply your authentic strengths to achieve meaningful results. After learning to know myself, I became obsessed with understanding my opponents, not just their military capabilities, but their thinking patterns, their decision-making processes, their fears, and motivations. I discovered that victory often comes not from superior strength, but from superior understanding of how your opposition thinks and acts. Most generals studied enemy formations and troop numbers. I studied enemy commanders. I wanted to understand how they made decisions under pressure, what biases influenced their thinking, what assumptions they operated under, and what patterns they repeated without realizing it. This psychological intelligence proved far more valuable than knowing how many soldiers they commanded. I developed a systematic approach to gathering this intelligence. I would spend weeks observing enemy behavior from a distance, noting when they moved, how they responded to different situations, what decisions they made consistently, and where they seemed most and least confident. I studied their past campaigns, looking for patterns in their strategic choices. The breakthrough came when I realized that most commanders had predictable blind spots. They would consistently overvalue certain types of information while ignoring others. They would default to familiar strategies even when circumstances called for different approaches. They would project their own thinking onto their opponents, assuming others would react the way they would react. In one particular campaign, I spent a month studying an opposing general who had never lost a battle. Everyone feared him, but I noticed something in his pattern of victories. He always won through overwhelming force applied at the point of his choosing. His strength was also his limitation. He couldn't conceive of victory through any other method. Instead of trying to match his strength, I created a situation where overwhelming force couldn't be applied effectively. I spread my forces across multiple positions, making it impossible for him to concentrate his advantage at any single point. When he tried to mass his troops against one position, I would withdraw and threaten another. His greatest strength became his greatest frustration. In your modern workplace, this same principle applies to understanding the people who control opportunities and resources. Who are the real decision makers in your organization? How do they evaluate performance and potential? What do they value most, and what concerns them most? What patterns can you identify in their past decisions? Most people make the mistake of assuming that merit alone drives organizational decisions. But every leader has biases, preferences, communication styles, and ways of thinking that influence their choices. Understanding these patterns gives you enormous strategic advantage. Start by observing carefully. How does your manager make decisions? Do they prefer detailed analysis or quick summaries? Do they value innovation or reliability? Are they influenced more by data or by relationships? Do they respond better to formal presentations or informal conversations? What times of day or week are they most receptive to new ideas? Study the people who have succeeded in your organization. What paths did they take? What skills did they develop? What relationships did they build? What strategies did they use to gain visibility and influence? Look for patterns that reveal the unwritten rules of advancement in your environment. Also observe your competitors, colleagues who are vying for similar opportunities. What are their strengths and weaknesses? What strategies are they using? Where are they focusing their efforts? What blind spots might they have that create opportunities for you? I learned to gather this intelligence without being obvious about it. I would listen carefully during meetings, noting not just what was said, but how decisions were made and who influenced them. I would observe interactions during informal moments when people were less guarded. I would ask thoughtful questions that revealed thinking patterns and priorities. One crucial insight I developed: most people have consistent patterns of weakness as well as strength. They tend to make the same types of mistakes repeatedly. They have predictable blind spots that persist across different situations. Identifying these patterns allows you to position yourself to avoid their strengths while capitalizing on their limitations. But understanding your opposition goes beyond individual psychology. You must also understand the structural forces they're operating under. What pressures are they facing? What constraints limit their options? What objectives are they trying to achieve? Sometimes what appears to be personal opposition is actually someone responding logically to their own strategic position. I also learned to distinguish between real threats and apparent threats. Often the people who seem most powerful are actually the most constrained by their positions. Meanwhile, seemingly minor players may have significant behind-the-scenes influence. Understanding the real power structure, not just the organizational chart, is crucial for effective positioning. Remember that this intelligence gathering is not about manipulation or deception. It's about understanding the strategic landscape accurately so you can position yourself effectively. When you understand how others think and what drives their decisions, you can create proposals, solutions, and approaches that align with their priorities while advancing your own objectives. The goal is not to defeat your colleagues, but to understand the system well enough to position yourself where your contributions will be most valued and your advancement most logical. The supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. This principle represents the highest level of strategic thinking, achieving your objectives through positioning and influence rather than direct confrontation. Most people never reach this level because they're addicted to the drama of conflict, but true strategic mastery lies in making conflict unnecessary. I discovered this principle during what should have been one of my most difficult campaigns. We faced an enemy that held a seemingly impregnable fortress. Conventional wisdom dictated a siege that would cost thousands of lives and months of resources. Instead, I spent weeks studying not the fortress, but the political situation that made the fortress necessary. I learned that the enemy commander was ambitious but insecure, desperately seeking recognition from his superiors. His position in the fortress was actually precarious. If he failed to demonstrate decisive action, he would be replaced. I also discovered that several of his key allies were already questioning his judgment and looking for reasons to withdraw their support. Rather than attacking the fortress, I created conditions that forced him to attack me. I positioned my forces in a way that made it appear we were preparing to bypass his fortress entirely and threaten more valuable targets behind him. This created unbearable pressure for him to abandon his defensive advantage and come out to fight. On ground of my choosing, when he finally attacked, his own allies witnessed him making the very mistake they had feared, abandoning a strong position for an unnecessary battle. The defeat I inflicted on him was devastating not just militarily, but politically. His allies withdrew support, his superiors questioned his judgment, and the fortress surrendered without further bloodshed. This victory taught me that the most efficient path to success often involves creating conditions where your opponents defeat themselves. Instead of trying to overcome their strengths directly, you position yourself so that maintaining their current course becomes impossible or counterproductive for them. In your modern career, this principle transforms how you approach workplace challenges and advancement. Instead of trying to outwork your competition or directly challenge existing power structures, you can position yourself so that supporting your success becomes the logical choice for decision makers. Consider the colleague who always seems to get the best assignments and recognition. Most people would either try to work harder to outshine them or attempt to undermine them directly. Strategic thinking suggests a different approach. Understand what makes them valuable to leadership, then position yourself to complement rather than compete with their strengths. If they're valued for their technical expertise, position yourself as the person who can translate that expertise into business results. If they're recognized for their innovation, become known as the person who can implement innovative ideas effectively. Instead of trying to replace them, make yourself indispensable to their success, which makes you indispensable to the organization. This approach creates what I call inevitable advancement. When your success becomes intertwined with others' success, when your contributions become essential to important initiatives, when your positioning makes you the obvious choice for opportunities, advancement happens naturally without requiring you to defeat anyone. I learned to identify win-win positioning opportunities by studying organizational needs carefully. What challenges is leadership struggling with? What goals are they trying to achieve? What gaps exist between current capabilities and desired outcomes? Position yourself as the solution to genuine problems, and advancement becomes logical rather than competitive. Another application of this principle involves managing conflicts without direct confrontation. When facing opposition or resistance, I learned to look for the underlying interests driving that opposition. Often, what appears to be personal conflict is actually people protecting their own positions or pursuing their own objectives. Instead of fighting the opposition directly, I would find ways to address their underlying concerns while still achieving my objectives. Sometimes this meant restructuring proposals to eliminate perceived threats. Sometimes it meant finding ways for potential opponents to gain credit or benefit from supporting my initiatives. I remember one situation where a senior colleague consistently blocked my ideas in meetings. Rather than challenging him directly, I spent time understanding his position. I discovered he was concerned about his team's workload and worried that my proposals would create additional pressure for his people. Once I understood this, I modified my approach. I presented my next proposal with a detailed plan for how it would actually reduce his team's workload by streamlining existing processes. Suddenly, he became one of my strongest supporters, and my idea was implemented with enthusiastic organizational support. This is the essence of winning without fighting, understanding the forces that drive opposition and repositioning so that supporting you becomes more attractive than opposing you. It requires patience, careful observation, and creative thinking, but it's far more efficient than trying to overcome resistance through force or persistence. The supreme excellence also applies to personal positioning within organizations. Instead of demanding recognition or promotion, create conditions where recognizing and promoting you becomes the obvious choice. Make yourself indispensable to important outcomes, visible to key decision-makers, and aligned with organizational priorities. When you master this principle, you'll find that opportunities come to you naturally, conflicts resolve themselves, and your career progresses with much less friction and much greater certainty. All warfare is based on deception, but the greatest deception is making your enemies believe that position doesn't matter. In reality, strategic positioning is everything. The army that controls the high ground, the supply routes, and the strategic choke points will defeat a larger, stronger force that fights from poor positions every time. I learned this lesson early when observing a battle where inferior forces completely routed a superior army simply because they had chosen their ground wisely. They forced their enemies to attack uphill across a river with the sun in their eyes while defending from prepared positions with clear retreat routes. The outcome was determined by geography and positioning, not by courage or numbers. This observation revolutionized my thinking about strategy. I realized that most conflicts are won or lost in the positioning phase, long before any direct confrontation occurs. The side that controls the most advantageous positions can dictate the terms of engagement and force their opponents to fight on unfavorable ground. In your modern workplace, strategic positioning works exactly the same way. Your position within the organization, your relationships with key decision-makers, your access to important information, and your visibility during crucial moments determine your career trajectory far more than raw talent or effort alone. Most people focus on executing their current role well, which is equivalent to fighting bravely from poor ground. They work harder, stay later, and produce better results, but they remain invisible to the people who make advancement decisions because they're positioned outside the strategic landscape where careers are actually made. Strategic positioning begins with understanding the real terrain of your organization. Where are the centers of power and influence? Which departments, projects, or initiatives receive the most attention and resources from leadership? What challenges keep senior executives awake at night? Where are the growth opportunities that will matter most to the company's future? I always sought to position my forces at the intersection of where value was created and where decisions were made. In your career, this means positioning yourself where you can contribute to outcomes that matter most to organizational success while being visible to the people who recognize and reward those contributions. This might mean volunteering for cross-functional projects that give you exposure to senior leadership. It could involve developing expertise in areas that are becoming critical to the company's strategy. It might require building relationships with people in other departments who influence resource allocation and opportunity distribution. The key insight is that strategic positions are often different from obvious positions. The most visible role isn't always the most strategically advantageous. Sometimes the person who coordinates between departments has more influence than the department heads themselves. Sometimes the individual who manages key client relationships has more strategic value than their formal title suggests. I learned to identify strategic positions by following the flow of information, decisions, and resources through an organization. Where do important conversations happen? Who gets consulted before major decisions are made? Which roles provide access to multiple power centers? Which positions offer visibility during times of crisis or opportunity? One of my most successful positioning strategies involved placing myself at communication crossroads, positions where I naturally became aware of developments across multiple areas of the organization. This gave me superior intelligence about emerging opportunities and threats, allowing me to position myself advantageously before others even recognized what was happening. Another crucial aspect of strategic positioning is timing your moves to coincide with organizational changes. During periods of growth, restructuring, or strategic shifts, new positions of influence emerge while others lose relevance. The people who recognize and claim these emerging strategic positions gain enormous advantages over those who remain in static roles. I also learned to create strategic positions when they didn't exist naturally. Sometimes this meant proposing new initiatives that would require exactly the skills and background I possessed. Sometimes it involved identifying gaps between departments and positioning myself as the natural bridge. Sometimes it required volunteering to solve problems that others were avoiding, thereby creating a position of unique value. Strategic positioning also requires understanding the difference between being important and being replaceable. You want to position yourself where your contributions are both valuable and difficult to replicate. This might involve developing unique combinations of skills, building irreplaceable relationships, or becoming the institutional memory for critical processes. Remember that good strategic positions often take time to develop. You're playing a positioning game that unfolds over months and years, not days and weeks. This requires patience and consistent effort. But the compound effect of good positioning is extraordinary. The ultimate goal of strategic positioning is to make your advancement logical and inevitable. When you're positioned at the center of Important activities contributing to critical outcomes and visible to key decision makers, opportunities flow naturally toward you. You're no longer competing for advancement. You're the obvious choice for advancement. He who is prudent and lies in wait for an enemy who is not will be victorious. Timing is the master key that unlocks strategic advantage. I have seen brilliant strategies fail because of poor timing, and simple plans succeed beyond imagination, because they were executed at precisely the right moment. Early in my career, I learned this lesson through a costly mistake. I had developed what I believed was a perfect strategy to defeat a troublesome opponent. My analysis was sound, my positioning was excellent, my resources were adequate, but I acted too early before the conditions were truly favorable, and what should have been an easy victory became a prolonged struggle that cost far more than necessary. That failure taught me that strategy without timing is like a sword without a handle, potentially powerful, but impossible to wield effectively. From that moment, I became a student of timing, learning to read the rhythms of conflict and change with the same precision that farmers read the seasons. I discovered that every situation has natural rhythms and cycles. There are moments when opponents are strong and confident, and other moments when they are vulnerable and uncertain. There are periods when organizations are receptive to change, and other periods when they resist it. Learning to recognize these patterns and position your actions accordingly multiplies your effectiveness exponentially. In warfare, I learned to watch for the subtle signs that indicated when enemies were overextended, when their attention was divided, when their resources were strained, or when their leadership was distracted. These were the moments when even modest pressure could produce dramatic results, while the same pressure applied at the wrong time would accomplish nothing. Your modern workplace operates according to similar rhythms. Organizations have cycles of expansion and consolidation, periods of stability and transformation, moments of crisis and opportunity. Learning to read these patterns allows you to time your strategic moves for maximum impact. Pay attention to budget cycles, strategic planning periods, leadership transitions, and organizational restructuring. These are times when new opportunities emerge, when decision makers are most receptive to fresh ideas, and when positioning yourself advantageously can produce lasting benefits. I also learned to recognize the personal rhythms of key decision makers. Every leader has patterns, times when they're most open to new ideas, periods when they're focused on specific priorities, moments when they're under pressure and need solutions, and phases when they're planning for the future and seeking new talent. Understanding these personal rhythms allows you to present ideas, make requests, and position yourself when the timing is most favorable. The same proposal that gets rejected during a stressful period might be enthusiastically embraced when presented at a moment when the leader is focused on growth and innovation. Strategic timing also requires patience, one of the most difficult virtues to develop in our instant gratification culture. I learned to prepare thoroughly for opportunities while waiting for the right moment to act. This meant building capabilities before I needed them, developing relationships before I required their support, and positioning myself before opportunities became visible to others. There's a difference between being ready and being premature. Being ready means you can act immediately when the right moment arrives. Being premature means you act before conditions are favorable, often damaging your position and reducing your chances of future success. I developed the discipline of strategic patience by recognizing that acting too early is often worse than acting too late. When you act prematurely, you alert potential opposition, waste resources on unfavorable conditions, and may not get another chance. When you wait for the right moment, your actions become more powerful and more likely to succeed. This doesn't mean being passive or waiting for perfect conditions. Those never come. It means preparing actively while watching for the moment when. Your preparation intersects with favorable circumstances. When that intersection occurs, you must be ready to act decisively and quickly. I also learned to create favorable timing when it didn't occur naturally. Sometimes this meant influencing the pace of events to create the conditions I needed. Sometimes it involved positioning myself so that when predictable cycles occurred, I would be ready to capitalize on them. One powerful timing strategy involves acting just ahead of visible trends, when you can recognize changes before they become obvious to everyone else. You can position yourself to benefit from those changes rather than merely react to them. This requires developing sensitivity to weak signals and early indicators of organizational shifts. Another crucial timing principle is understanding momentum. There are moments when small actions can trigger large changes, and other moments when even significant efforts produce minimal results. Learning to recognize when momentum is building allows you to add your efforts at precisely the moment when they will have maximum impact. Remember that timing is not just about when to act, but also when not to act. Sometimes the most strategic choice is to wait, to let unfavorable conditions pass, to allow opposition to exhaust itself, or to let others make mistakes that create opportunities for you. Strategic patience often requires more discipline than strategic action. Know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril. But this knowledge doesn't arrive by accident. It must be systematically gathered, carefully analyzed, and strategically applied. Information is the foundation of all successful strategy, yet most people operate with incomplete, outdated, or inaccurate intelligence about their strategic environment. I learned the power of information warfare during a campaign where I faced an opponent with superior numbers and equipment. Conventional analysis suggested certain defeat, but I suspected that appearance might be deceiving. Instead of accepting the obvious intelligence, I invested heavily in gathering deeper information about my opponent's true situation. What I discovered changed everything. While their army appeared formidable, they were actually struggling with supply problems, internal conflicts between commanders, and declining morale among troops who hadn't been paid in months. Their strength was largely facade, maintained through careful positioning and aggressive rhetoric, designed to intimidate opponents into surrender without fighting. Armed with this intelligence, I developed a strategy that exploited their hidden weaknesses rather than confronting their apparent strengths. The victory that followed was so decisive that other enemies began surrendering before battles even began, simply because they knew I possessed superior intelligence capabilities. This experience taught me that information warfare operates on multiple levels. First, you must gather accurate intelligence about your strategic environment. Second, you must protect your own strategic information from competitors. Third, you must sometimes influence what information others possess or believe to be true. In NEWAM, your modern workplace, information warfare is equally critical, but far more subtle. The colleague who always seems to be in the right place at the right time isn't lucky. They have superior intelligence about organizational priorities, upcoming changes, and emerging opportunities. They know things before others know them, and they use that advantage to position themselves strategically. Start by developing systematic methods for gathering organizational intelligence. This isn't about gossip or rumors. It's about understanding the real forces driving decisions, the actual priorities of leadership, and the genuine challenges facing your organization. What keeps senior executives concerned? What metrics do they watch most closely? What external pressures are influencing their strategic thinking? Pay attention to patterns in budget allocation, hiring decisions, and resource investment. These actions reveal true priorities more accurately than official communications. When leadership puts money and resources behind something, that tells you what they really care about, regardless of what they say publicly. Build a network of information sources throughout the organization. Cultivate relationships with people in different departments, at different levels, and with different perspectives. Each person sees part of the organizational picture, and combining these perspectives gives you a much more complete understanding of the strategic landscape. I learned to gather intelligence through careful listening and thoughtful questioning. Most people reveal far more than they realize during casual conversations. By asking the right questions and listening carefully to the answers, you can piece together a comprehensive understanding of organizational dynamics, power structures, and emerging opportunities. Document and analyze the information you gather. Look for patterns, trends, and contradictions. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from noticing what's not being said, what topics are being avoided, or what initiatives are losing momentum quietly. Track decisions over time to understand how your organization really makes choices. Protecting your own strategic information is equally important. Don't broadcast your strategic plans, career ambitions, or job search activities. Be thoughtful about what you reveal about your capabilities, your concerns, and your future intentions. Information shared carelessly can be used against you by competitors or can eliminate the element of surprise from your strategic moves. I developed the discipline of compartmentalizing information, sharing different pieces with different people, so no single person outside my inner circle had complete visibility into my strategic thinking. This protected my plans while still allowing me to gather feedback and build support for specific elements of my strategy. Sometimes strategic advantage comes from influencing what information others possess or how they interpret it. This isn't about deception or dishonesty. It's about framing information in ways that support your strategic objectives. When presenting ideas or proposals, emphasize the aspects that align with organizational priorities and downplay elements that might create unnecessary resistance. Learn to read between the lines of organizational communications. Official announcements often reveal as much through what they don't say as through what they do say. Changes in tone, emphasis, or terminology can signal shifts in strategy or priorities before those changes become explicitly stated. Develop sensitivity to early warning signals of organizational change. These might include shifts in leadership behavior, changes in meeting patterns, new terminology appearing in communications, or subtle adjustments in resource allocation. Recognition of these weak signals allows you to prepare for changes before they become obvious to everyone else. Remember that information has a shelf life. Strategic intelligence that was accurate last month may be completely outdated today. Organizations change rapidly, and the information that drives your strategic decisions must be continuously updated and refreshed. The goal of information warfare is not just to know more than your competitors, but to know the right things at the right time. Quality and timing of intelligence matter more than quantity. Focus on gathering information that actually influences your strategic decisions rather than accumulating data for its own sake. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe he is facing. This principle of adaptability became the cornerstone of my strategic philosophy after I witnessed too many brilliant generals fail because they couldn't adjust their thinking when circumstances changed. I remember a campaign where I had developed what seemed like a perfect strategy based on months of careful planning and intelligence gathering. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for, every resource allocated precisely. Yet within hours of engaging the enemy, it became clear that our fundamental assumptions were wrong. The opponent had changed their approach completely, making our elaborate preparations largely irrelevant. Many commanders would have pressed forward with the original plan, hoping that determination could overcome changed circumstances. I learned to abandon my attachment to predetermined strategies the moment they stopped serving their purpose. Instead of fighting reality, I embraced it and adapted my approach to fit the actual situation rather than the situation I had planned. 4. This experience taught me that strategic flexibility is not a weakness, it's a supreme strength. The commander who can think clearly and adapt quickly when circumstances change will defeat the more powerful opponent who remains rigid in their approach. Adaptability multiplies your strategic options, while rigidity reduces them. In your modern workplace, this principle is even more critical because the pace of change has accelerated dramatically. The strategy that worked last year may be counterproductive this year. The skills that made you valuable in your previous role may be irrelevant in your current position. The relationships that once provided opportunities may no longer be strategically important, yet most professionals resist adaptability because it feels like admitting failure or abandoning their identity. They continue using outdated approaches, clinging to obsolete strategies, and developing irrelevant capabilities because change feels threatening. This rigidity makes them increasingly vulnerable as their environment evolves around them. True, strategic adaptability requires developing comfort with uncertainty and change. You must learn to hold your strategies lightly, committed enough to execute them effectively, but flexible enough to abandon them when they no longer serve your objectives. This balance between commitment and flexibility is one of the most difficult strategic skills to master. I learned to build adaptability into my strategic thinking from the beginning. Instead of creating rigid plans, I would develop multiple scenarios and prepare contingencies for each one. Instead of committing all my resources to a single approach, I would maintain reserves that could be deployed quickly when unexpected opportunities or threats emerged. Adaptability also requires developing sensitivity to early signals that your current approach is losing effectiveness. Most people continue with failing strategies long after the evidence suggests they should. Change course? They rationalize poor results, blame external factors, or simply hope that persistence will eventually produce success. Strategic thinkers monitor their results carefully and adjust their approach based on what they learn. If a particular strategy for gaining visibility isn't working, they try different approaches rather than doing more of what's failing. If their current positioning isn't generating opportunities, they shift to more advantageous ground rather than waiting for circumstances to change. I developed the habit of regularly questioning my fundamental assumptions about my strategic environment. What beliefs about my organization, my industry, or my career trajectory might no longer be accurate? What changes in the external environment might require adjustments to my approach? What feedback am I receiving that suggests my current strategy needs modification? This questioning process often revealed that I was operating on outdated information or assumptions that were once true but no longer valid. Markets shift, organizations evolve, leadership changes, and priorities transform. Strategies that don't adapt to these changes become progressively less effective. Another crucial aspect of adaptability is learning to think in terms of principles rather than tactics. Tactics are specific actions that work in particular circumstances. Principles are underlying truths that can be applied flexibly across different situations. When you understand the principles behind successful strategies, you can adapt those principles to new circumstances rather than trying to repeat specific tactics that may no longer be relevant. For example, the principle of strategic positioning applies whether you're trying to gain influence in a traditional corporate hierarchy or navigate a flat, networked organization. The specific tactics for positioning yourself will be completely different, but the underlying principle remains valid. I also learned to view obstacles and setbacks as information rather than simply problems to overcome. When something doesn't work as expected, that failure provides valuable intelligence about your environment and your approach. Instead of being discouraged by failures, strategic thinkers extract lessons that improve their future strategies. Adaptability requires maintaining multiple options and avoiding overcommitment to any single path. This means building diverse skills, cultivating relationships across different areas, and maintaining awareness of alternative opportunities. When your primary strategy encounters obstacles, you can shift to alternative approaches rather than being trapped by your previous choices. Remember that adaptability is not the same as inconsistency or lack of direction. You maintain consistent objectives while adapting your methods for achieving them. Your destination remains stable while your route adjusts to changing terrain. The skillful leader subdues the enemy's troops without any fighting. He captures their cities without laying siege to them. He overthrows their kingdom without lengthy operations in the field. True leadership emerges not from formal authority, but from strategic thinking that others want to follow. Throughout my career, I observed that the most effective leaders were rarely the ones with the most impressive titles or the loudest voices. Instead, they were the individuals who could see patterns others missed, anticipate challenges before they became crises, and position their teams for success in ways that seemed almost effortless. Their leadership grew from strategic insight, not organizational hierarchy. I learned this lesson during a period when I held no formal command, but found myself increasingly consulted by other officers facing difficult decisions. They sought my counsel not because of my rank, but because my strategic thinking consistently provided clarity in complex situations. I realized that strategic competence creates its own form of authority that often proves more powerful than appointed leadership. This experience taught me that leadership through strategy operates on a completely different level than leadership through position. When you can see opportunities and threats that others cannot, when you can develop solutions that address root causes rather than symptoms, when you can position your team advantageously while competitors struggle, people naturally want to follow your guidance. Strategic leadership begins with developing the ability to see the bigger picture, while others remain focused on immediate tasks. Most people operate within narrow perspectives defined by their immediate responsibilities. Strategic leaders learn to zoom out and understand how individual actions connect to larger patterns and outcomes. In your modern workplace, this means understanding how your team's work fits into broader organizational objectives, how market forces influence your company's strategy, and how current decisions will create future opportunities or constraints. When you can help others understand these connections, they begin to see you as someone who provides valuable perspective and direction. I discovered that strategic leaders distinguish themselves by asking different questions than everyone else. While others ask, "How do we solve this immediate problem?" strategic leaders ask, "Why does this problem keep recurring?" While others ask, "How do we work harder?" strategic leaders ask, "How do we work from a better position?" These different questions lead to fundamentally different solutions. Strategic leadership also involves helping others develop their own strategic thinking rather than simply providing answers. When you teach someone to recognize patterns, anticipate consequences, and think systematically about positioning, you create capability that extends far beyond any specific situation. This approach builds loyalty and influence that lasts. One of my most effective leadership strategies involved making others successful through strategic thinking. Instead of competing with talented colleagues, I would help them apply strategic principles to advance their own objectives. This created a network of successful people who attributed part of their success to my guidance and who naturally looked to me for direction in new situations. This approach works because it aligns with people's self-interest while demonstrating your strategic value. When your thinking consistently helps others achieve their goals, they become invested in maintaining their relationship with you. Your influence grows organically as your strategic contributions prove their worth. Strategic leaders also excel at building consensus around direction rather than forcing compliance through authority. When you can help a group understand why a particular course of action makes strategic sense, they commit to that direction with much greater energy than they would to orders imposed from above. I learned to present strategic options in ways that made the optimal choice obvious to others. Instead of simply announcing decisions, I would outline the strategic landscape, explain the implications of different choices, and guide the group toward recognizing the best path forward. This approach builds buy-in while establishing your role as a strategic thinker. Another crucial aspect of strategic leadership involves timing your interventions for maximum impact. Rather than trying to influence every decision, strategic leaders choose their moments carefully. They speak up when their perspective can make the most difference and remain quiet when others are better positioned to provide guidance. This selective engagement enhances your credibility because people learn that when you do offer input, it's likely to be valuable and well considered. Your influence grows stronger when it's applied strategically rather than constantly. Strategic leaders also understand that influence often works more effectively through informal channels than formal ones. Building relationships, having conversations outside official meetings, and helping people think through challenges privately often accomplishes more than public presentations or formal proposals. I cultivated the habit of making myself available for strategic conversations without being pushy or self-promoting. When people faced complex decisions, they knew they could rely on me for thoughtful analysis and objective perspective. This informal advisory role often proved more influential than formal leadership positions. Remember that strategic leadership is about creating conditions where others want to follow your thinking because it helps them succeed. You're not manipulating or controlling. You're providing genuine value through superior strategic insight. When your thinking consistently helps people achieve better outcomes, leadership becomes a natural result rather than something you have to claim or demand. In war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak. This principle extends beyond military conflict to encompass all resource allocation decisions. The strategic leader achieves maximum results with minimum expenditure of resources by applying force precisely where it will have the greatest impact. Early in my career, I made the mistake that destroys most promising strategists. I tried to do everything at once. I spread my limited resources across multiple objectives, believing that working harder on more fronts would accelerate my progress. Instead, I achieved mediocre results in every area, while my more focused competitors gained decisive advantages in specific domains. This failure taught me the principle of concentrated effort. Rather than dispersing your limited time, energy, and attention across numerous objectives, strategic success requires identifying the few critical areas where investment will produce disproportionate returns, then concentrating your resources on those high-leverage opportunities. I learned to analyze every potential investment of resources through a strategic lens. Would this activity advance my most important objectives? Would it position me advantageously for future opportunities? Would it build capabilities that would compound over time? If the answer to these questions was no, I would decline the opportunity, regardless of how appealing it might seem in isolation. This discipline of strategic resource allocation transformed my effectiveness dramatically. Instead of being busy but unproductive, I became highly selective but increasingly successful. The same amount of effort applied more strategically produced exponentially better results. In your modern career, resource management operates according to identical principles. Your most precious resources are your time, attention, energy, and credibility. How you allocate these resources determines whether you advance strategically or simply stay busy without progressing. Most professionals make the same mistake I initially made. They try to excel at everything. They volunteer for every interesting project, attempt to develop every possible skill, and spread their attention across too many priorities. This diffusion of effort prevents them from achieving the depth of impact necessary for strategic advancement. Strategic resource allocation begins with honest assessment of your current resources and their limitations. How much discretionary time do you actually have for strategic activities? How much mental energy remains after handling your core responsibilities? What level of additional commitment can you sustain without compromising your existing performance? Once you understand your resource constraints, you must make difficult choices about where to invest them. This requires developing clear criteria for evaluating opportunities. I learned to assess potential investments based on three factors: strategic impact, probability of success, and alignment with my core strengths. Strategic impact means the opportunity will meaningfully advance your most important long-term objectives. Probability of success means you have realistic chances of achieving meaningful results given your current capabilities and resources. Alignment with core strengths means the opportunity allows you to leverage your natural advantages rather than forcing you to compete in areas where you're disadvantaged. Opportunities that score highly on all three factors deserve significant resource investment. Opportunities that score poorly on any factor should generally be declined, regardless of how attractive they might appear otherwise. This filtering process prevents you from wasting resources on activities that feel productive but don't advance your strategic position. I also learned the importance of maintaining resource reserves for unexpected opportunities. When you allocate all your time and energy to planned activities, you cannot respond quickly when strategic opportunities emerge. Maintaining some uncommitted capacity allows you to move decisively when favorable circumstances arise. Another crucial aspect of resource management involves understanding the difference between activities that consume resources and activities that create resources. Some investments of time and energy generate returns that compound over time, while others simply drain your capacity without building future capability. Building relationships with strategically positioned people creates resources that appreciate over time. Developing skills that become increasingly valuable creates compound returns on your investment. Establishing your reputation in areas that matter to organizational success generates ongoing dividends. These resource-creating activities should receive priority over resource-consuming activities that produce only immediate, temporary benefits. I learned to track my resource allocation decisions and measure their strategic returns. Which activities consistently produced advancement toward my objectives? Which investments of time and energy generated the highest returns? Which opportunities looked attractive but delivered disappointing results? This analysis helped me refine my allocation criteria over time. Strategic resource management also requires learning to say no gracefully but firmly. Every yes to one opportunity is an implicit no to other opportunities. If you cannot decline requests that don't align with your strategic priorities, you cannot maintain focus on the activities that will actually advance your position. I developed standard criteria for evaluating requests on my time and attention. This allowed me to make decisions quickly and consistently without having to analyze each request individually. When opportunities didn't meet my criteria, I could decline immediately rather than agonizing over decisions that had already been made by my strategic framework. Remember that resource management is ultimately about opportunity cost, the value of the best alternative use of your limited resources. Every hour spent on a low-impact activity is an hour not spent on a high-impact activity. Strategic thinking requires constantly choosing the highest value uses of your precious resources. All warfare is based on deception. When you are able to attack, you must seem unable. When using your forces, you must appear inactive. When you are near, you must make the enemy believe you're far away. When far away, you must make him believe you are near. This principle often makes people uncomfortable because they confuse strategic misdirection with dishonesty, but they operate on entirely different ethical levels. Strategic misdirection is about controlling what information your competitors have about your capabilities, intentions, and timing. It's not about lying or breaking commitments. It's about maintaining privacy around your strategic thinking so that others cannot position themselves to counter your moves before you make them. I learned this principle during a campaign where I made the mistake of being too transparent about my strategic intentions. During planning meetings, I openly discussed my analysis of enemy weaknesses and my intended approach for exploiting them. I believed that sharing my thinking would build confidence among my officers and create better coordination during execution. What I didn't realize was that information has a way of traveling even when you don't intend it to. Within days, my detailed strategic plan had reached my opponent through networks of communication I hadn't even considered. When we finally engaged, they had repositioned their forces to neutralize every advantage I had planned to exploit. My transparency had turned my strength into their strength. This experience taught me that strategic privacy is not deception, it's necessary protection of your competitive advantage. When others know your plans, timeline, and reasoning, they can position themselves to block your success or claim credit for your insights. Strategic misdirection prevents this by controlling what information others have access to. In your modern workplace, this principle applies to protecting your career, strategies, job search activities, and advancement plans. Broadcasting your intentions often creates unnecessary competition and resistance. Others may position themselves to claim opportunities you've identified, or they may work to block your advancement if they see you as a threat to their own ambitions. Strategic misdirection might involve being vague about your timeline when discussing potential role changes. It could mean downplaying your interest in opportunities until you're ready to pursue them seriously. It might involve letting others assume you're content with your current situation while you're actually developing plans for advancement. This is not about being dishonest in your communications. It's about being selective about what information you share and when you share it. There's a significant difference between lying about your intentions and simply keeping your strategic thinking private until the appropriate time to reveal it. I learned to distinguish between operational transparency and strategic privacy. I remained completely honest about my current responsibilities, my performance, and my immediate commitments. But I kept my long-term strategies, my analysis of organizational weaknesses, and my plans for advancement private until the right moment to act on them. Another form of strategic misdirection involves managing others' perceptions of your capabilities and intentions. Sometimes it's advantageous to appear less threatening than you actually are, allowing competitors to underestimate you while you build strength quietly. Other times, it's useful to appear more formidable than your current position suggests, deterring challenges while you solidify your advantages. I remember a situation where a colleague was actively working to undermine my position by questioning my capabilities in front of senior leadership. Instead of defending myself directly, which would have escalated the conflict and drawn attention to his accusations, I used strategic misdirection. I began asking him for advice on challenges I was supposedly struggling with, challenges I had actually already solved but hadn't implemented yet. This made him feel superior and less threatened while positioning me to implement solutions that would demonstrate my competence at the perfect moment. When I revealed the results, his previous criticisms made him look petty and inaccurate. Strategic misdirection also involves timing the revelation of information for maximum impact. Rather than sharing good news immediately, strategic thinkers often wait for moments when that information will have the greatest positive effect on their positioning. Rather than addressing rumors or speculation directly, they sometimes allow misconceptions to persist when correcting them would be strategically disadvantageous. I learned to use strategic ambiguity as a form of misdirection. When asked about my future plans or intentions, I would give answers that were technically honest but didn't reveal specific details that could be used against me. This allowed me to maintain relationships and avoid creating unnecessary opposition while protecting my strategic privacy. The key to ethical strategic misdirection is maintaining your integrity while controlling information flow. You never lie, break commitments, or act dishonestly. But you don't volunteer information that others could use to position themselves against your interests, and you don't clarify misconceptions that work to your advantage. This principle also applies to managing your reputation and image. Sometimes it's strategically advantageous to let others focus on your obvious strengths while quietly developing capabilities they don't expect. When you eventually demonstrate these hidden capabilities, the surprise amplifies their impact. Remember, that strategic misdirection is a defensive tool as much as an offensive one. It protects your strategic initiatives from interference while they're still developing. Once your position is strong enough to withstand competition, transparency often becomes more advantageous than privacy. Rapidity is the essence of war. Take advantage of the enemy's unreadiness, make your way by unexpected routes, and attack unguarded spots. In strategy, speed often matters more than perfect planning, and momentum can overcome obstacles that would be impossible to defeat through preparation alone. I discovered this principle during a campaign where careful planning had consumed so much time that the strategic window began closing. While I deliberated over perfect tactics and comprehensive contingency plans, my opponent was moving swiftly to consolidate advantages and eliminate my options. I realized that my pursuit of the perfect strategy was becoming the enemy of effective strategy. That experience taught me that in rapidly changing environments, the speed of decision-making and execution often determines success more than the quality of the initial plan. A good strategy implemented quickly usually produces better results than a perfect strategy implemented too late. Once you understand this principle, it transforms how you approach strategic opportunities. Most professionals suffer from analysis paralysis when facing important decisions. They want to gather more information, consider additional options, and reduce uncertainty before acting. While thorough analysis has value, it also has costs: time, opportunity, and momentum. The strategic thinker learns to balance preparation with responsiveness. I developed the ability to make high-quality decisions quickly by creating frameworks for evaluation rather than analyzing each situation from scratch. When opportunities emerged, I could rapidly assess them against predetermined criteria rather than conducting lengthy deliberations. This allowed me to move while competitors were still planning. Strategic speed begins with recognizing that perfect information is never available. You must learn to act on sufficient information rather than complete information. The question isn't whether you have all the data you would like, but whether you have enough data to make a sound decision. Often, 70% certainty is sufficient to begin moving while others remain paralyzed by the unknown 30%. I also learned that speed creates its own advantages beyond simply being first to act. When you move quickly and decisively, you often catch others unprepared. They haven't positioned themselves to respond effectively because they didn't anticipate your rapid movement. This gives you temporary advantages that can be leveraged into lasting strategic gains. Fast execution also creates momentum that becomes self-reinforcing. When others see you moving confidently and achieving results, they want to align themselves with your success. Resources, support, and opportunities flow toward momentum rather than hesitation. People prefer to follow leaders who are making progress rather than those who are still deliberating. However, strategic speed is not the same as recklessness. True velocity in strategy comes from rapid execution of sound principles, not from hasty action without thought. I learned to prepare thoroughly for the types of decisions I expected to face, so that when those situations arose, I could act immediately. Based on pre-established frameworks, this preparation involved developing clear criteria for different types of opportunities, understanding my available resources and constraints, and identifying the key information needed for various categories. of decisions. When situations matched my prepared frameworks, I could move immediately. When they didn't, I could quickly determine what additional analysis was needed. Another crucial aspect of strategic speed involves recognizing when windows of opportunity are opening and closing. Markets shift, organizational priorities change, leadership attention moves to new areas, and competitive landscapes evolve. The strategic opportunities available today may not exist tomorrow, making speed of response critical. I learned to watch for early signals of emerging opportunities and position myself to move quickly when those opportunities materialized. This required maintaining resources in reserve, keeping capabilities flexible, and staying alert to environmental changes that created new strategic possibilities. Strategic momentum also has psychological dimensions. When you're moving forward consistently, obstacles seem more manageable and solutions seem more attainable. When you're stalled or moving slowly, the same challenges appear overwhelming and insurmountable. Maintaining forward momentum, even at a modest pace, keeps you in a strategic mindset rather than a defensive one. I discovered that momentum can often substitute for resources in overcoming resistance. When people see you making consistent progress toward objectives, they're more likely to support your efforts, provide assistance, and remove obstacles. Static strategies invite opposition, while dynamic strategies attract support. Building momentum requires celebrating incremental progress rather than waiting for major victories. Each small advancement creates evidence of your strategic effectiveness and builds confidence for larger moves. This compound effect of small successes often produces breakthrough results that couldn't be achieved through any single action. Speed in strategy also means learning to fail fast when approaches aren't working, rather than persisting with ineffective strategies. Because of the time already invested, strategic thinkers quickly recognize when course corrections are needed and implement them immediately. This prevents small failures from becoming large disasters. The goal is to maintain what I call strategic velocity, consistent forward movement toward your objectives at a pace that allows for adjustment but doesn't sacrifice opportunities. To hesitation. You're moving fast enough to capitalize on favorable conditions, but not so fast that you cannot adapt to changing circumstances. Remember that in our rapidly changing world, the strategic advantage often goes to those who can learn, decide, and act faster than their competition, not necessarily to those with the best initial plans. He who knows when to fight and when not to fight will be victorious, but equally important is knowing when to stand alone and when to build alliances. The greatest strategic victories often result not from individual excellence, but from the ability to align multiple parties toward common objectives that serve everyone's interests. I learned this lesson during what seemed like an impossible situation. I faced an opponent who commanded vastly superior resources and had defeated every army that challenged him directly. Conventional analysis suggested that victory was impossible unless I could change the fundamental dynamics of the conflict by bringing other forces into play. Instead of accepting defeat or attempting a hopeless direct assault, I spent months studying the broader political landscape. I discovered that my powerful opponent had created resentment among several smaller states through his aggressive expansion. While none of these states could challenge him individually, together they represented a formidable coalition. The key insight was understanding that I didn't need to convince these states to help me. I needed to show them how helping me would serve their own interests. Each had been threatened by our common opponent's expansion. Each would benefit from seeing his power reduced. By framing our alliance in terms of mutual benefit rather than asking for favors, I transformed potential allies into committed partners. When we finally engaged, it wasn't one army against another, but a coordinated coalition against an isolated opponent. The victory that followed established my reputation as a strategist who could achieve impossible results through superior alliance building rather than superior force. This experience taught me that strategic alliances multiply your capabilities far beyond what you could achieve alone. But successful alliances require understanding that everyone involved must benefit meaningfully from the relationship. The moment an alliance becomes one-sided, it begins to weaken and eventually dissolve. In your modern workplace, alliance building operates according to identical principles. The colleagues who advance most rapidly aren't necessarily the most talented individually. They're the ones who can build networks of mutual support that amplify everyone's effectiveness. They understand that success in complex organizations requires coalition building, not just individual performance. Strategic alliance building begins with mapping the influence networks in your organization. Who makes the key decisions? Who influences those decision makers? Who controls important resources or processes? Who has access to critical information? Understanding these relationships allows you to identify potential allies whose support would advance your objectives. The most effective alliances are built on genuine mutual benefit, rather than one-way exchanges. Instead of asking colleagues to help you achieve your goals, look for situations where your success enables their success. When your advancement helps others advance, when your projects create opportunities for others, when your ideas solve problems that concern multiple people, alliance building becomes natural and sustainable. I learned to identify shared objectives that weren't immediately obvious to others. Two colleagues might both benefit from improved communication between their departments, even if they haven't recognized this connection. A manager might benefit from having a more strategically positioned team member, even if they haven't considered how to create that positioning. Finding these hidden alignments of interest creates opportunities for powerful alliances. Successful alliance building also requires investing in relationships before you need them. The time to build alliances is when you don't desperately need support, not when you're facing a crisis. People are much more receptive to building relationships when they don't feel they're being used to solve immediate problems. I made it a practice to regularly look for ways to help others succeed, expecting nothing immediate in return. When colleagues faced challenges in my areas of expertise, I would offer assistance. When I learned about opportunities that might interest others, I would share that information. When someone needed support for a project that aligned with organizational objectives, I would provide it. This approach built a network of people who had positive associations with working with me. When I later needed support for my own initiatives, many of these colleagues were naturally inclined to help because our previous interactions had been mutually beneficial. Strategic alliances also require careful management over time. Relationships change, priorities shift, and organizational dynamics evolve. An alliance that made perfect sense 6 months ago might no longer serve everyone's interests today. Maintaining effective alliances requires ongoing attention to whether they continue to create mutual value. I learned to regularly assess my alliance network and make adjustments when relationships were no longer strategically relevant. This wasn't about being calculating or using people. It was about focusing my limited relationship-building energy on connections that could create the most mutual benefit. Another crucial aspect of alliance building involves managing multiple relationships without creating conflicts of interest. Sometimes potential allies have competing objectives or conflicting priorities. Successful strategic thinkers learn to maintain positive relationships with multiple parties while avoiding being trapped in the middle of their conflicts. This requires what I call strategic authenticity, being genuinely supportive of others' success while maintaining clarity about your own objectives. You can simultaneously want multiple colleagues to succeed while recognizing that some of their goals might not align with yours. The key is being honest about these complexities rather than pretending conflicts don't exist. The most powerful alliances often emerge around shared principles or values rather than just shared objectives. When you can identify colleagues who approach their work with similar standards of excellence, similar ethical frameworks, or similar long-term thinking. These relationships tend to be more stable and more strategically valuable over time. Remember that the strongest alliances are built on abundance thinking rather than scarcity thinking. When you approach relationships with the belief that there are enough opportunities for everyone to succeed, others sense this and are more willing to collaborate. When you operate from fear that others' success threatens your own, you unconsciously create resistance to alliance building. Every battle is won before it is fought. The general who arrives on the battlefield and begins planning has already lost to the general who spent months preparing for that exact moment. This principle transformed my understanding of strategy when I realized that visible action is only the final expression of invisible preparation that determines the outcome. I learned this lesson through careful observation of why some commanders consistently achieved victories that seemed impossible, while others failed despite apparent advantages. The difference wasn't in their battlefield tactics, it was in the depth and quality of their preparation. Winners had anticipated multiple scenarios, prepared for various contingencies, and positioned their resources optimally before conflicts began. The commanders who lost had superior courage, better equipment, and more motivated troops. But they approached each battle as an isolated event requiring immediate improvisation rather than the culmination of systematic preparation. When unexpected challenges arose, they had no prepared responses and were forced to make critical decisions under pressure with incomplete information. This observation led me to revolutionize my approach to strategy. Instead of focusing primarily on execution, I began investing the majority of my time and energy in preparation. I would spend weeks studying potential opponents, analyzing terrain, anticipating problems, developing contingency plans, and positioning resources before any direct engagement occurred. The results were dramatic. Battles that appeared challenging to outside observers often unfolded exactly as I had anticipated because I had prepared for the scenarios that actually occurred. What looked like tactical brilliance was actually strategic preparation manifesting. At the moment of action, in your modern career, this principle applies with equal force. The professionals who seem to effortlessly advance, who always have the right answers in meetings, who consistently receive the best opportunities, they're not lucky or naturally gifted. They're systematically preparing for success, while others are simply hoping for it. Strategic preparation begins with developing deep understanding of your professional environment. This means studying not just your immediate role, but the broader context in which your organization operates. What challenges is your industry facing? What trends are shaping your field? What skills will become increasingly valuable? What changes are likely to create new opportunities? Most professionals remain focused on their current responsibilities without investing time in understanding the forces that will shape their future opportunities. This reactive approach leaves them unprepared when changes occur, forcing them to scramble to adapt rather than position themselves advantageously for predictable developments. I learned to identify the types of situations I was likely to encounter and prepare responses in advance. If budget cuts were possible, I would develop proposals for maintaining effectiveness with reduced resources. If expansion was likely, I would prepare plans for scaling my responsibilities. If leadership changes were anticipated, I would position myself to work effectively with different management styles. This preparation allowed me to respond quickly and confidently when these situations actually arose. While others were still analyzing what was happening, I was already implementing prepared solutions. This responsiveness enhanced my reputation as someone who could be counted on during challenging periods. Preparation also involves building capabilities before you need them. Most people try to develop skills reactively, after they're required, for a new role or responsibility. Strategic thinkers identify the capabilities they'll need for future advancement and begin developing them while they're still in their current position. This might mean taking on projects that stretch your abilities, seeking mentorship in areas where you want to grow, or developing expertise in emerging technologies before they become mainstream requirements. When opportunities arise that require these capabilities, you're already qualified rather than needing time to catch up. Another crucial aspect of preparation involves building relationships and networks before you need them. The time to expand. Your professional network is not when you're job searching, it's when you're successfully positioned in your current role. The relationships that will support your next advancement should be developed while you're still advancing in your current position. I made it a practice to regularly connect with people in roles I might want in the future, in organizations I might want to join, and in fields that were becoming strategically important. These conversations weren't about immediate opportunities. They were about understanding trends, learning about different paths, and building relationships that might become valuable later. Strategic preparation also requires developing institutional memory about your successes. Most people complete projects and move on without documenting their contributions or learning from their experiences. Strategic thinkers maintain records of their achievements, the challenges they overcame, and the value they created. When opportunities for advancement arise, you can quickly provide specific examples of your track record rather than offering vague generalizations about your capabilities. This preparation allows you to present compelling cases for your advancement based on documented evidence rather than subjective impressions. I also learned to prepare for setbacks and obstacles as systematically as I prepared for opportunities. What would I do if my current role were eliminated? How would I respond if my manager changed and had different expectations? What alternative paths could I pursue if my primary advancement strategy encountered obstacles? This contingency planning provided confidence and options when challenges did arise. Instead of panicking or making hasty decisions during difficult periods, I could implement prepared alternatives that maintained my strategic positioning while addressing immediate concerns. Remember that preparation is not just about having plans, it's about building the capabilities, relationships, and resources that make success inevitable when opportunities arise. The goal is to position yourself so that when the right moment comes, you're not just ready to act, but thoroughly prepared to succeed. The general who wins a battle but loses the war has achieved nothing of lasting value. True strategic thinking requires seeing beyond immediate victories to ultimate objectives that may take years to achieve. This perspective separates tactical thinkers from strategic masters. I learned this distinction during a campaign where I achieved a series of impressive tactical victories that actually weakened my long-term position. Each battle was won decisively, each opponent was defeated completely, and my reputation grew with every engagement. Yet these victories consumed resources, created new enemies, and positioned me poorly for the larger conflict that was developing. My focus on immediate success had blinded me to the strategic consequences of my tactical choices. I was winning battles, but losing the war, because I had confused short-term achievement with long-term advantage. This painful lesson taught me that strategic thinking must always operate with extended time horizons. From that moment, I began evaluating every decision through the lens of long-term consequences. How would this choice affect my position a year from now? What precedents would it establish? What capabilities would it build or destroy? What relationships would it strengthen or damage? What opportunities would it create or eliminate? This long-term perspective completely transformed my approach to strategy. Instead of optimizing for immediate results, I began positioning myself for sustained advantage over time. Instead of seeking quick wins, I focused on building foundations that would support multiple victories across extended periods. In your modern career, this principle is even more critical because the pace of change has accelerated while the consequences of strategic decisions have become more lasting. The choices you make today about skills to develop relationships to build, and positions to pursue will determine your options and advantages for years to come. Most professionals operate with quarterly or annual time horizons, optimizing for immediate performance reviews, short-term projects, and current organizational priorities. Strategic thinkers extend their planning horizon to 5, 10, or even 20 years, understanding that the most important career advantages compound over extended periods. Long-term strategic thinking begins with developing a clear vision of where you want to be in the future. Not just the next promotion or role change, but your ultimate professional objectives. What type of work do you want to be doing? What level of influence do you want to achieve? What kind of problems do you want to solve? What legacy do you want to create? Once you have clarity about your ultimate destination, you can work backward to identify the capabilities, experiences, relationships, and positions that will be necessary to achieve those objectives. This reverse engineering process reveals the strategic path from your current position to your desired future. I learned to think in terms of strategic stepping stones rather than single leaps. Each role, project, and opportunity should advance you toward your ultimate objectives while building capabilities for the next step in your progression. This sequential approach allows you to make seemingly modest moves that accumulate into transformational career advancement over time, long terms. Strategic thinking also requires understanding industry trends and societal changes that will shape future opportunities. What technologies are emerging that could disrupt your field? What demographic shifts are creating new markets or changing existing ones? What regulatory changes are likely to affect your industry? What global trends are influencing organizational priorities? By positioning yourself ahead of these trends, rather than reacting to them after they become obvious, you can build expertise and relationships in areas that will become increasingly valuable. This forward-thinking approach creates competitive advantages that compound over time as trends mature and create mainstream opportunities. Another crucial aspect of long-term strategy involves building what I call strategic optionality, positioning yourself so that multiple favorable paths become available rather than committing to a single trajectory. This might mean developing diverse skills that could be valuable in different scenarios, building relationships across multiple industries or functions, or maintaining financial flexibility that allows you to take calculated risks. Strategic optionality protects you from being trapped by changes in your environment while positioning you to capitalize on unexpected opportunities. When industries shift, technologies evolve, or organizational priorities change, you have multiple ways to adapt and advance rather than being forced into reactive damage control. I also learned to distinguish between activities that provide immediate gratification and activities that build long-term advantage. Many choices that feel satisfying in the short term actually limit your future options, while investments that require patience and discipline in the present create enormous advantages over time. This might mean choosing challenging assignments that develop capabilities over comfortable roles that offer immediate recognition. It could involve building relationships with people who aren't currently influential but have high potential for future leadership. It might require developing expertise in emerging areas rather than optimizing performance in established domains, long terms. Strategic thinking also involves understanding that setbacks and obstacles are temporary while strategic positioning is cumulative. A project that fails, a promotion that doesn't materialize, or a relationship that doesn't develop as expected are short-term disappointments that don't negate the value of sound strategic positioning. The key is maintaining confidence in your long-term strategy while adapting your tactics to address immediate challenges. Strategic consistency combined with tactical flexibility allows you to stay focused on ultimate objectives while navigating the inevitable obstacles and surprises that arise along any extended path. Remember that in our rapidly changing world, the professionals who thrive over decades are those who combine long-term strategic vision with continuous adaptation to evolving circumstances. They're playing a long game while remaining responsive to short-term opportunities and challenges. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, but that step must be taken in the right direction. Everything I have shared with you, the principles of strategic positioning, the art of timing, the power of preparation, the wisdom of alliances, means nothing without disciplined implementation. Your transformation from tactical thinking to strategic mastery begins today, and the next 90 days will determine whether these principles become the foundation of your success or merely interesting concepts you once heard. I have given you the strategic framework that guided my victories across decades of conflict. Now you must adapt these timeless principles to your modern battlefield. The workplace may have changed from ancient China, but human nature, organizational dynamics, and the fundamental laws of strategic advantage remain constant. Your 90-day transformation begins with strategic assessment. Spend the first week conducting an honest evaluation of your current position using the frameworks I have taught you. Know yourself. What are your genuine strengths, real limitations, available resources, and authentic motivations? Know your environment. Who holds power, how decisions are made, what challenges matter most to leadership, and where opportunities are emerging. Document this assessment clearly and specifically. Vague self-knowledge produces vague strategies. You need precise understanding of your starting position to develop an effective path forward. Most people skip this foundational step because it requires uncomfortable honesty, but strategic success demands accuracy over comfort. During your second week, identify your strategic objectives for the next 12 months. Not just what you want to achieve, but what you want to become. What position do you want to hold? What capabilities do you want to develop? What relationships do you want to build? What reputation do you want to establish? Your tactical activities must serve these strategic objectives, or you will remain busy without advancing. Week 3 should focus on positioning analysis. Using the principles of strategic positioning I have shared, identify where you need to be to achieve your objectives. What projects would give you the right visibility? What relationships would provide the necessary influence? What skills would make you indispensable? What information would give you competitive advantage? Create a positioning plan that moves you systematically toward strategic ground over the next 6 to 9 months. This isn't about dramatic changes that attract attention and resistance. It's about deliberate movement that appears natural but accumulates into significant advantage. The 4th week is for alliance assessment and relationship strategy. Map the influence networks in your organization and identify the key relationships that could accelerate your progress. Plan how you will build these relationships through mutual value creation rather than one-sided requests for support. Weeks 5 through 8 focus on capability building. Identify the 3 most important skills or areas of knowledge you need to develop for your strategic advancement. Create specific plans for developing these capabilities while executing your current responsibilities. Remember, you want to be prepared for opportunities before they arise, not scrambling to qualify after they appear. During weeks 9 through 12, implement your strategic positioning moves. Begin volunteering for the right projects, building the identified relationships, and demonstrating the capabilities you've been developing. Move deliberately but confidently, understanding that strategic positioning takes time to establish but creates lasting advantage. The final 2 weeks of your first month should focus on information systems, establish methods for gathering and analyzing intelligence about your environment, create regular practices for monitoring organizational changes, leadership priorities, and emerging opportunities. Superior information leads to superior strategic decisions. Your second month intensifies implementation while adding the element of tactical patience. You will begin seeing early results from your positioning efforts, but resist the temptation to accelerate beyond sustainable pace. Strategic advantage builds systematically And rushing often undermines the very positioning you're trying to create. Focus weeks 6 through 8 on refining your approach based on initial feedback. What's working better than expected? What's meeting more resistance than anticipated? How can you adjust your tactics while maintaining strategic direction? Strategic adaptability requires constant calibration. Your third month integrates everything into a sustainable strategic operating system. By now, strategic thinking should be becoming habitual rather than forced. You should be naturally evaluating opportunities through strategic lenses, automatically considering long-term implications of short-term decisions, and instinctively positioning yourself for advantage. The final weeks should focus on measuring your progress and planning your next strategic phase. What positioning have you achieved? What capabilities have you developed? What relationships have you built? What intelligence systems have you established? Most importantly, what strategic options are now available that weren't accessible 90 days ago? Throughout this transformation, remember that you are playing a long game while executing short-term tactics. Every conversation, every project, every decision should advance your strategic positioning while contributing to immediate organizational success. This integration of strategic thinking with tactical execution is the hallmark of true strategic mastery. The principles I have shared with you are not merely career advice. They are fundamental laws of strategic advantage that apply whether you are commanding armies or managing your professional development. Master these principles, and you will find that success becomes not a matter of luck or chance, but the inevitable result of superior strategic thinking. Your journey toward strategic mastery begins now. The next 90 days will reveal whether you have the discipline to transform knowledge into wisdom, principles into practice, and strategic thinking into strategic results. I have given you the map. Now you must walk the path. Go forth and claim your strategic advantage. The battlefield awaits, and victory belongs to those who think strategically while others merely react tactically.